The crystal glass shattered against marble, red wine bleeding across the white tablecloth like a wound. Nadia's hands didn't shake as she knelt to collect the fragments, even as laughter erupted from table 12. The corner booth where 3 men in $1,000 suits sat dissecting her accent, her name, her worth. "Maybe she'll understand if we speak slower," the one with platinum cufflinks sneered, voice carrying across Lumiere's dining room. "Or should we draw pictures?" Nadia's fingers closed around a shard of glass. In the reflection, she caught sight of the photograph tucked behind her name tag, a younger version of herself shaking hands with the ambassador to Jordan. The same hands now picking up their mess. She stood slowly, Arabic flowing from her lips like silk over steel. Their laughter died. Some storms announce themselves with thunder. Others arrive in perfect silence. The late afternoon sun filtered through Lumiere's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric shadows across the pristine marble floors that Nadia Palmer had scrubbed clean at 5 that morning. She moved between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make themselves invisible, balancing plates with the same steady hands that once held diplomatic briefings worth millions. The irony wasn't lost on her that people now looked through her as if she were furniture, when just 3 years ago, ambassadors had hung on her every word. But that was before the whistleblowing scandal that had ended her career, before the legal fees had drained her savings, and before her mother's medical bills had forced her into this gilded prison of white tablecloths and condescending smiles. "Wherever you're watching from," she thought as she refilled water glasses with mechanical precision, "you're probably wondering how someone ends up here. The fall from diplomatic immunity to serving immunity from reality for Manhattan's elite happens faster than you'd think." The restaurant buzzed with the low hum of power lunches and merger discussions, the kind of conversations that shaped markets while the speakers dabbed caviar from their lips. Nadia had perfected the art of selective hearing over the past 18 months, filtering out the casual cruelty that seemed as essential to these people as their platinum credit cards. She caught fragments of Russian from Table 4, where oil executives discussed pipeline routes through Syria, German from Table 7, where pharmaceutical representatives calculated profit margins on refugee camp medications, and now, from Table 12, the harsh consonants of Arabic spoken with the careless confidence of men who believe themselves untouchable. Vincent Crawford sat at the head of the booth, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his handmade Italian suit worth more than most people's annual salaries, discussing what sounded like humanitarian aid contracts with 2 men whose expensive watches couldn't quite hide the calluses that spoke of less legitimate enterprises. Nadia's steps slowed as she approached their section, her trained ear catching words that made her blood freeze. They were discussing the Al-Noor Foundation, the same refugee assistance program she had helped establish during her tenure at the State Department. Vincent leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to buying silence, and continued speaking in Arabic about terminating funding, about eliminating obstacles, about ensuring certain witnesses never made it to testimony. His companions nodded, one checking his phone while discussing transportation routes through Jordan and Syria, routes Nadia knew intimately from her diplomatic work. The casual way they planned destruction over dinner rolls made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to maintain her composure, to continue playing the role of the uncomprehending waitress who couldn't possibly understand the weight of their words. These were the moments that separated survival from stupidity in her new reality, knowing when to reveal her hand and when to hold her cards close to her chest. Vincent's eyes followed her as she refilled his water glass, and she could feel his assessment like fingers trailing across her skin. "Nadia," he read from her name tag, pronouncing it with exaggerated care, as if speaking to a child. "That's an interesting name. Where are you from, sweetheart?" The endearment dripped with condescension, and his companions chuckled as if he had delivered a particularly clever joke. She met his gaze with the practiced neutrality she had perfected over months of similar encounters, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "New York, sir. Born and raised." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had been born in Queens, though she had spent more of her adult life in embassy compounds than apartment buildings. Vincent smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, and continued in Arabic to his companions about how these people always claimed to be American when it suited them. His words cut deeper than he could know, not because they wounded her pride, but because they revealed the casual racism that made men like him believe they could speak freely in front of people they considered beneath notice. The afternoon shift change approached, and Nadia found herself grateful for the approaching reprieve from Vincent's table and their increasingly detailed discussions of financial irregularities in Middle Eastern aid distribution. She had managed to serve them without incident for over an hour, her Arabic comprehension allowing her to understand exactly how deep Vincent's corruption ran while maintaining the facade of ignorant compliance. The other wait staff moved around her like water around a stone, most of them genuine immigrants working multiple jobs to support families, people who deserved better than the casual disdain Vincent's type exhibited. Maria, a single mother from El Salvador, caught her eye and nodded toward the kitchen, their silent signal that the evening shift was ready to take over. Nadia began collecting the last of her section's dishes, her movements automatic, while her mind raced through implications of what she had overheard. Vincent's company wasn't just profiting from humanitarian crises, they were actively creating them. And the Al-Noor Foundation she had helped establish was apparently next on their list of obstacles to remove. As she balanced a tray of empty glasses, Vincent's voice rose above the restaurant's ambient noise, his laughter sharp and cutting as he continued his Arabic conversation. He was describing his plans for the Foundation's board meeting, scheduled for the following week, where he would propose budget cuts that would effectively shut down operations in 3 refugee camps. His casual mention of removing personnel who ask too many questions sent ice through her veins, because she knew the type of personnel he meant: aid workers, journalists, and former government officials like herself, who understood the true cost of his profit margins. The photograph behind her name tag seemed to burn against her chest, a reminder of the woman she used to be, the one who had sworn oaths to protect the innocent and uphold international law. That woman would have acted immediately, would have used her diplomatic channels to expose this conversation within hours. But that woman had been destroyed by the last time she had tried to do the right thing, and Nadia Palmer, the waitress, had learned the hard way that moral victories often came with prices too high to pay. The evening light cast long shadows across Lumiere's dining room as Vincent Crawford's voice carried with the confidence of a man who believed himself beyond consequence. His Arabic had grown more careless with each glass of wine, the conversation with his associates becoming increasingly explicit about their methods for managing humanitarian oversight. Nadia moved through her section like a ghost, every instinct screaming at her to walk away, to finish her shift and pretend she hadn't understood a word of their planning session. But fate rarely offered such clean exits, and Vincent's next words froze her in place near the coffee station. He was describing the Al-Noor Foundation's current director by name, Dr. Sarah Mansouri, a brilliant woman who had mentored Nadia during her State Department years and who now ran the very programs Vincent planned to destroy. The casual way he discussed eliminating Sarah's influence, the administrative obstacles he would create to force her resignation, the funding he would redirect to shell companies, it painted a picture of systematic destruction that went far beyond simple corporate greed. Vincent's companion, a thin man with expensive glasses and nervous hands, leaned closer to discuss logistics. They spoke of manufactured scandals, falsified audit reports, and strategic timing that would coincide with upcoming congressional hearings on foreign aid allocation. Nadia's grip tightened on the coffee pot she was refilling, her knuckles white against the silver surface. These weren't just business deals. They were calculated attacks on programs that kept families alive, that provided medical care to children in war zones, that offered hope in places where hope was the only currency that mattered. The scope of Vincent's network became clearer with each detail: senators who could be bought, journalists who could be silenced, and aid workers who could simply disappear into the bureaucratic maze of international incident reports. Her former colleagues' faces flashed through her mind, dedicated people who believed in the mission, who had no idea they were being systematically undermined by men who viewed human suffering as a market opportunity. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade as Vincent's voice rose with what he clearly considered wit, switching to English to address his server. "Excuse me, sweetheart," he called to Nadia, his tone dripping with false politeness. Could you explain the dessert menu to us? And please, speak slowly. I want to make sure we all understand each other." His companions laughed on cue, and Nadia felt the familiar burn of humiliation mixed with rage that had become her constant companion since taking this job. She approached their table with measured steps, her professional mask perfectly in place despite the storm building behind her eyes. But as she began to recite the dessert options, Vincent interrupted her with a comment in Arabic that cut through her composure like a blade through silks. He told his companions that she was exactly what you'd expect from these people. Pretty enough to serve food, but probably can't even spell diplomacy, adding with cruel laughter that at least she knows her place in the natural order. The words hung in the air like smoke, and something fundamental shifted in Nadia's chest. All the months of swallowed pride, all the careful silence, all the calculated invisibility that had kept her safe and employed, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. She set down the dessert menu with deliberate precision, her hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside her rib cage. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had once briefed cabinet members, the fluency of someone who had spent years navigating the diplomatic complexities of the Middle East, and the quiet fury of someone who had finally decided that silence was no longer an option. "In that case," she said in classical Arabic, her pronunciation flawless and her grammar formal enough to suggest serious education, "perhaps you could explain to me why a man who claims to support humanitarian efforts would discuss destroying refugee assistance programs while eating dinner paid for with money stolen from those same programs." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Vincent's wineglass stopped halfway to his lips, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and something approaching panic. His companions shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their entire conversation had been understood by someone who clearly possessed both the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge to interpret every nuance of their planning. Nadia continued speaking, her Arabic flowing with the kind of diplomatic precision that made native speakers sit up and pay attention. "Furthermore," she added, allowing just enough steel to enter her voice, "your grammar suggests you learned Arabic in business school rather than through cultural immersion, which explains why you incorrectly conjugated 3 verbs while discussing international law, a subject that apparently requires more expertise than you currently possess." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, the kind of linguistic cut that would resonate deeply in a culture that valued eloquence and proper education. Vincent's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan, and Nadia could see his mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. A waitress who spoke Arabic at this level wasn't just a waitress. She was someone with serious academic or professional background, someone who might have connections, someone who might pose a very real threat to his carefully constructed operations. She gave him a moment to process this realization before delivering her final line in English, her voice carrying just enough of her old diplomatic authority to make every word land like a physical blow. "Enjoy your dessert, gentlemen. I'm sure you'll find tonight's selection quite memorable." Then she turned and walked away, leaving them in stunned silence while the rest of the restaurant continued their oblivious conversations around a table where the balance of power had just shifted in ways none of them could have anticipated. The morning after Nadia's linguistic revelation found Vincent Crawford pacing the length of his corner office 40 floors above Manhattan, his usual composure replaced by the sharp-edged anxiety of a man who had just discovered an unexpected variable in what he had believed to be a controlled equation. The view from his windows encompassed half of Central Park, a vista that usually reminded him of his success and untouchability. But today it felt like a stage where unseen eyes might be watching his every move. He had built his empire on information, knowing more than his competitors, understanding the weaknesses of his opponents, and maintaining perfect control over every detail that might affect his interests. The fact that a waitress in an expensive restaurant possessed the linguistic sophistication to not only understand his Arabic, but to deliver a correction that revealed serious academic background was not just embarrassing. It was potentially catastrophic. His fingers drummed against his mahogany desk as he considered the implications, each possibility more disturbing than the last. Vincent's first call went to Marcus Sullivan, his head of private security, and a former CIA operative whose skills extended far beyond traditional corporate protection. Marcus arrived within the hour, his unremarkable appearance and quiet efficiency the perfect camouflage for someone whose job involved making problems disappear with minimal fuss. "I need everything you can find on a waitress at Lumiere," Vincent said without preamble, sliding a business card across his desk. "Nadia Palmer. Focus on education, employment history, and any government connections, and Marcus, I need this yesterday." The urgency in Vincent's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus nodded with the understanding of someone who had handled similar requests before. What neither man anticipated was that Nadia Palmer's background would prove to be a labyrinth of classified connections, diplomatic immunity records, and State Department clearances that painted a picture of someone far more dangerous than either had imagined. The initial search revealed fragments: a PhD in international relations from Georgetown, language certifications in Arabic, Farsi, and French, and employment gaps that suggested either academic sabbaticals or classified government work. By midday, Marcus had compiled a preliminary report that made Vincent's worst fears seem optimistic by comparison. Dr. Nadia Palmer wasn't just educated. She was a former State Department Middle East specialist who had held significant clearance levels and had worked directly with refugee assistance programs throughout Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. The timing of her departure from government service coincided with a whistleblowing scandal that had made headlines 3 years earlier, when an unnamed State Department official had attempted to expose corruption in foreign aid distribution. The official had been discredited, their career destroyed, and their identity protected by diplomatic protocols, until now. Vincent read through the report with growing unease, recognizing several names of programs and officials that intersected with his own operations in ways that could prove catastrophic if the right connections were made. Nadia Palmer wasn't just someone who spoke Arabic. She was someone who understood the entire infrastructure of Middle Eastern humanitarian aid. Someone who had the knowledge and contacts to unravel years of carefully constructed fraud. The implications stretched far beyond simple exposure. Vincent's network relied on the assumption that humanitarian aid workers were idealistic but naive, that government oversight was bureaucratic but manageable, and that the people affected by his operations were too powerless to pose any meaningful threat. Nadia represented the convergence of all his vulnerabilities, someone with insider knowledge, government connections, and apparently nothing left to lose after having her career destroyed once already for trying to do the right thing. Marcus's deeper investigation revealed even more troubling details. Nadia's current financial situation, her mother's medical expenses, and the leverage points that might have kept her silent up until now. But it also revealed her network of former colleagues, her reputation among humanitarian organizations, and her potential ability to rebuild the professional bridges that his operations had worked so hard to burn. The photograph Marcus had obtained from her State Department personnel file showed a different woman entirely, confident, authoritative, surrounded by the trappings of diplomatic success that were now buried beneath a waitress's uniform. Vincent's phone rang as he studied the photograph, and Marcus's voice carried a note of professional concern that made Vincent's stomach tighten. "There's more," Marcus said without preamble. "Palmer's former supervisor at State was Dr. Sarah Mansouri, the same woman currently running the Al-Noor Foundation that's on your target list for next week's board meeting. They maintained contact after Palmer's resignation, and there are indications that Palmer has been consulting informally on refugee assistance policy despite her official employment status. If Palmer connects your conversation from last night to the Foundation's upcoming budget review, she'll have both the knowledge and the motivation to cause serious problems." The circle was closing in ways Vincent hadn't anticipated, and he found himself facing a scenario where past and present collided with potentially devastating results. He had spent years cultivating the image of a legitimate businessman whose humanitarian investments happened to be profitable. But Nadia Palmer possessed the expertise to see through that facade to the systematic exploitation underneath. The afternoon brought an additional complication that transformed Vincent's growing concern into active alarm. Marcus had discovered that Nadia's apartment lease was month to month. Her employment at Lumiere was technically temporary, and her mother's medical treatment was scheduled to conclude within weeks. all of which suggested that her current situation might be transitional rather than permanent. The possibility that she might be planning to return to her former career, armed with inside knowledge of Vincent's operations and free from the financial constraints that currently kept her silent, was unacceptable. "I want surveillance on her immediately," Vincent instructed Marcus, his voice carrying the cold precision that emerged when he shifted from businessman to predator. "Phone, email, physical location, everything. And I want options prepared for managing the situation if it escalates beyond our control." The transformation was complete. Nadia Palmer had evolved from an annoyance to a threat, and Vincent Crawford had not built his empire by allowing threats to flourish unchecked. The message arrived on Thursday morning, delivered with Nadia's pay stub in an envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Inside, beneath the notification that her hours had been temporarily reduced due to seasonal adjustments, lay a business card embossed with Vincent Crawford's name and the logo of Crawford International Development. The irony of the company name wasn't lost on her. Development that systematically destroyed the infrastructure it claimed to build. Progress measured in quarterly profits rather than human welfare. She turned the card over to find a handwritten note in Vincent's precise script. "Dr. Palmer, I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd welcome the opportunity to discuss potential consulting opportunities that might better utilize your obvious expertise. My assistant will call to arrange a meeting at your convenience." The formality was a thin veneer over what Nadia recognized as a chess move. Vincent's attempt to control the narrative after discovering that his carefully maintained facade had been penetrated by someone with the knowledge to expose it. Nadia's first instinct was to throw the card away and pretend the encounter had never happened, to retreat back into the safety of invisibility that had protected her for the past 18 months. But as she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by medical bills and past due notices, she found herself studying Vincent's offer with the analytical mind that had once made her valuable to the State Department. The timing wasn't coincidental. Her reduced hours at Lumiere would create exactly the kind of financial pressure that might make his offer seem attractive, and his use of her doctorate title suggested that he knew enough about her background to understand what leverage might work. The phone rang within hours, Vincent's assistant speaking with the kind of professional courtesy that masked an underlying threat. "Lunch tomorrow, 1 o'clock, at Vincent's private office to discuss mutually beneficial opportunities in international consulting." The assistant's tone suggested that declining wasn't really an option, and Nadia found herself agreeing to a meeting that she knew represented either an opportunity or a trap, possibly both. Crawford International Development occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that screamed expensive minimalism, the kind of corporate architecture designed to intimidate visitors while projecting an image of streamlined efficiency. Nadia arrived precisely on time, her appearance carefully calculated to suggest competence without revealing the full extent of her professional background. The elevator ride to the 38th floor gave her time to review what she knew about Vincent's public business operations. Legitimate enough on the surface, but clearly profitable in ways that didn't match the modest scale of his declared humanitarian investments. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman who clearly understood more than her title suggested, escorted Nadia through corridors lined with photographs of ribbon cuttings and handshakes with various officials, the visual mythology of a man who had built his reputation on carefully orchestrated public relations. The office itself was a study in controlled opulence, expensive enough to impress but tasteful enough to suggest serious business rather than ostentatious wealth. Vincent rose from behind his desk as she entered, his smile perfectly calibrated between apology and authority, extending his hand with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm when possible and pressure when necessary. "Dr. Palmer," he said, and the way he used her title felt like both an acknowledgement and a warning. "Thank you for coming. I hope we can put Tuesday evening behind us and focus on more productive possibilities." He gestured toward a seating area arranged around a coffee table that probably cost more than most people's cars, the kind of casual luxury that was meant to demonstrate his success while creating an informal atmosphere for serious negotiation. As they settled into leather chairs that whispered expense with every movement, Nadia noticed the subtle details that revealed Vincent's true interests. Maps of the Middle East marked with oil pipeline routes, corporate awards from defense contractors, and photographs with officials whose humanitarian credentials were questionable at best. The conversation began with carefully modulated pleasantries, Vincent demonstrating his knowledge of her academic background while avoiding direct reference to her government service or the circumstances surrounding her resignation. He spoke of Crawford International's expanding operations in cultural consulting, the growing need for expertise in Middle Eastern affairs, and the substantial compensation packages available for qualified professionals willing to provide discreet advisory services. His pitch was sophisticated and compelling, painting a picture of legitimate business opportunities that would allow her to return to meaningful work while solving her financial difficulties. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Nadia could hear the subtle undertones that revealed the true nature of his offer. References to confidentiality agreements, mentions of the complicated nature of international business, and carefully phrased questions about her ongoing relationships with former colleagues. When he casually mentioned her mother's medical situation and expressed sympathy for the financial burden of quality health care, the message was clear. He knew enough about her vulnerabilities to apply pressure where it would be most effective. The meeting reached its crucial moment when Vincent excused himself to take what he claimed was an urgent call, leaving Nadia alone in his office for exactly long enough to notice the documents scattered across his desk. The Arabic text was immediately recognizable. Correspondence with Syrian government officials about resource extraction rights, contracts with shell companies for humanitarian supply distribution, and budget projections that showed profit margins far exceeding any legitimate consulting operation. But it was the photograph clipped to one of the files that made her blood freeze. Dr. Sarah Mansouri, at a recent Al-Noor Foundation board meeting, her face circled in red ink with notes in Vincent's handwriting about obstacles to progress and timeline for resolution. The casual way Vincent had left these materials visible suggested either stunning carelessness or a deliberate test to see how she would react to evidence of his operation's true scope. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes watched her face with the intensity of a predator gauging its prey's response. Vincent's closing offer was delivered with the kind of finality that indicated the end of negotiations rather than their beginning. A six-figure consulting contract, immediate start date, and responsibilities that would involve reviewing humanitarian aid distribution in several countries where Crawford International had significant interests. The terms were generous enough to solve all of Nadia's financial problems while being specific enough to make clear that she would be expected to provide exactly the kind of inside knowledge that would allow Vincent to maximize his exploitation of aid programs. "I'll need an answer by tomorrow," Vincent said as he walked her to the elevator, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a claim than a courtesy. "I think you'll find that opportunities like this don't come along often for people in your current situation." The elevator doors closed on his smile, and Nadia found herself descending toward street level with the certainty that she had just been recruited for a war she wasn't sure she was prepared to fight. The contract arrived by courier at 6 in the morning. Thick legal documents that transformed Vincent's offer into binding obligations and non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties severe enough to ensure silence for life. Nadia spread the papers across her small kitchen table, her coffee growing cold as she studied clauses that were carefully worded to appear routine while granting Crawford International extraordinary control over her professional activities and personal communications. The compensation package was indeed generous. More money than she had seen since her government severance, enough to cover her mother's treatments and allow them both to rebuild something resembling normal lives. But embedded within the standard consulting language were requirements that would make her complicit in the very operations she had spent years trying to prevent. Cultural liaison services for emerging market development, translation and interpretation for international business negotiations, and advisory services for humanitarian investment optimization. Each euphemism was a carefully constructed trap that would bind her to Vincent's network while providing legal cover for activities that existed in the gray areas between legitimate business and systematic exploitation. The decision crystallized when Nadia's mother called from the hospital, her voice weak but determined as she described the latest round of treatments and the doctor's cautiously optimistic prognosis. Mrs. Palmer had sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities that previous generations could never have imagined, working multiple jobs to support Nadia's education and never once suggesting that her diplomatic career was anything less than a source of immense pride. The conversation was routine, updates on medication schedules, insurance complications, and the small victories that marked progress in serious illness. But underneath the medical details lay the unspoken reality that continued treatment required resources they didn't have. When her mother mentioned a new specialist whose services weren't covered by their current insurance, the timing felt like a deliberate reminder of the financial leverage Vincent had identified and was now exploiting. "Don't worry about the money, sweetheart," her mother said, with the kind of determined optimism that broke Nadia's heart. "We'll figure something out. We always do." The decision to sign the contract was made not with enthusiasm, but with the grim calculation of someone who understood the true cost of moral victories. Nadia's signature felt like a surrender, each letter an acknowledgement that survival sometimes required compromises that academic ethics courses never adequately addressed. But as she sealed the documents for return to Vincent's office, she activated a small recording device, a relic from her State Department days that had survived her career's destruction along with a few other tools of her former trade. If Vincent Crawford wanted to purchase her expertise, she would ensure that every conversation, every instruction, and every piece of evidence that passed through their professional relationship was preserved with the kind of meticulous documentation that had once made her valuable to government investigators. The device was small enough to remain undetected and sophisticated enough to capture audio with legal admissibility standards, an insurance policy that might prove valuable if their arrangement evolved beyond the bounds of legal consulting. Her first official day at Crawford International began with an orientation that was really an evaluation. Vincent's associates testing her knowledge while probing for potential weaknesses in her commitment to their cause. She met with Marcus Sullivan, whose introduction as head of corporate security couldn't quite disguise the operational background that showed in his posture and the way his eyes cataloged exit points and potential threats. The conversation covered standard security protocols, but the subtext was clear. Her communications would be monitored, her movements tracked, and her loyalties tested in ways both subtle and direct. When Marcus mentioned that employee safety was a priority, especially for those working with sensitive international clients, the implication was unmistakable. Cooperation was the only guarantee of continued good health. Nadia responded with appropriate professionalism while mentally noting the surveillance cameras and security checkpoints that would monitor her daily access to the building. The call to Detective Morgan Blake required careful timing and equally careful phrasing, made from a payphone 6 blocks from her apartment during a window between surveillance shifts that she had identified through 3 days of careful observation. Morgan's voice carried the weariness of someone who had spent too many years investigating corruption cases that were ultimately buried by procedural technicalities and political pressure. "Nadia Palmer," Morgan repeated after she introduced herself, and the long pause suggested rapid mental calculation of risk versus potential reward. "I remember your file from the State Department investigation. A lot of people thought you got a raw deal for trying to do the right thing." The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language of professionals who understood that telephone conversations were rarely as private as they appeared. But Morgan's interest was evident despite the cautious phrasing. When Nadia mentioned Crawford International and its humanitarian investments, Morgan's tone sharpened with recognition. They had apparently been developing their own interest in Vincent's operations through entirely separate investigative channels. The revelation that Crawford International was already under federal scrutiny transformed Nadia's situation from desperate gamble to strategic opportunity, though the risks remained substantial enough to require extraordinary caution. Morgan explained that they had been building a case for 18 months, focusing on financial irregularities and suspicious patterns in aid distribution, but lacking the kind of inside access that could provide definitive evidence of criminal activity. "What we need," Morgan said carefully, "is someone who understands both the legitimate operations and the illegal diversions, someone who can document the differences in real time." The proposal was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. Serve as an informal consultant to the FBI while maintaining her cover at Crawford International, gathering evidence that could bring down Vincent's entire network while protecting her own exposure to criminal charges. The arrangement would require her to walk a tightrope between cooperation and complicity, feeding information to federal investigators while convincing Vincent's security apparatus that her loyalties lay entirely with his organization. Morgan's final instructions carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the game they were proposing could become. Regular check-ins through coded messages, document preservation through secure channels, and emergency protocols if her cover was compromised. All delivered with the clinical precision of someone who had managed similar operations before. Crawford isn't just stealing money, Morgan explained as their conversation concluded. His operations are destabilizing entire regions, creating refugee crises that he then profits from through legitimate aid contracts. The human cost is measured in tens of thousands of lives, and the financial scope reaches into hundreds of millions of dollars. If we can make this case stick, it will be one of the largest humanitarian fraud prosecutions in federal history. The stakes were clear, and as Nadia returned to her apartment, she found herself committed to a course of action that would either restore her career and save countless lives, or destroy her completely while taking everyone she cared about down in the process. Nadia's first week as Crawford International's newest cultural consultant established a routine that was equal parts fascinating and terrifying. Each day revealing new layers of Vincent's systematic exploitation while requiring her to maintain the facade of enthusiastic cooperation. Her office on the 37th floor provided access to communication systems that carried conversations in half a dozen languages, financial documents that traced money through networks of shell companies across 3 continents, and strategic planning sessions that treated human suffering as a commodity to be optimized for maximum return on investment. Vincent had positioned her role as essential but contained. She was valuable enough to be included in operational planning, but junior enough to avoid the kind of executive decision-making that would make her indispensable or dangerous. The balance was carefully calculated to provide him with the cultural expertise he needed, while limiting her access to information that could pose existential threats to his organization, though his understanding of her true capabilities remained dangerously incomplete. The Crawford International headquarters hummed with the kind of efficient productivity that could only exist when moral considerations had been systematically eliminated from business planning. Nadia found herself translating correspondence with Syrian government officials who discussed oil extraction rights as if refugee camps were minor landscaping obstacles, reviewing contracts with Turkish intermediaries who specialized in what they euphemistically called population management services, and participating in conference calls with European partners whose humanitarian organizations existed primarily on paper while their bank accounts reflected substantial and regular deposits. Each document she processed was meticulously copied to secure drives that would eventually find their way to Detective Morgan Blake, building a comprehensive record of operations that stretched far beyond simple financial fraud into systematic war profiteering. The moral weight of what she was documenting required careful compartmentalization. She couldn't allow herself to fully process the human cost of Vincent's operations without risking the kind of emotional breakdown that would compromise her ability to gather evidence. Vincent's trust in her abilities grew with each successfully completed assignment, and Nadia found herself included in meetings that revealed the true scope of his international network. Crawford International maintained partnerships with defense contractors who supplied weapons to conflict zones, pharmaceutical companies that charged premium prices for medications in refugee camps, and logistics firms that controlled transportation routes for both legitimate aid and black market goods. The company's humanitarian investments were carefully structured to create dependencies that could be exploited for political leverage, refugee assistance programs that could be withdrawn to pressure uncooperative governments, medical facilities that could be relocated to influence migration patterns, and educational initiatives that could be used to identify and recruit potential assets among displaced populations. Vincent's genius lay in creating systems that appeared beneficial while serving primarily to concentrate power and generate profit. And his success depended on the willing participation of individuals who either shared his moral flexibility or remained ignorant of the true nature of their contributions. The breakthrough came during a Thursday afternoon meeting where Vincent casually mentioned the Al Noor Foundation's upcoming budget review, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed his victory was already assured. Nadia listened with growing horror as he detailed the administrative obstacles that had been strategically created to justify funding cuts, the audit irregularities that had been planted to suggest fiscal irresponsibility, and the timeline that would ensure Dr. Sarah Mansouri's resignation before she could mount an effective defense of her programs. The attack was comprehensive and ruthless. Financial pressure combined with professional sabotage and personal harassment designed to destroy both the organization and its leadership. When Vincent asked Nadia to review correspondence with Foundation board members and identify potential pressure points for accelerating the decision timeline, she found herself in the impossible position of being asked to help destroy programs that represented her own life's work while maintaining the appearance of professional detachment. The personal stakes became devastatingly clear when Vincent shared a list of Al Noor Foundation personnel who would need to be relocated as part of the organizational restructuring. Aid workers, administrators, and field coordinators whose names Nadia recognized from her own diplomatic assignments. These were people who had risked everything to provide assistance in war zones, who had chosen humanitarian service over more lucrative careers, and who were now targeted for elimination simply because their effectiveness threatened Vincent's profit margins. Among the names was David Chen, a young program coordinator who had been one of her State Department interns, and Maria Santos, a nurse practitioner who had worked with Nadia to establish medical clinics in refugee camps across Jordan. The realization that Vincent's operations would not only destroy programs, but potentially endanger the lives of specific individuals she had mentored and worked alongside transformed her investigation from professional obligation into deeply personal mission. Vincent's request for her to translate threatening communications to these targeted personnel represented a moral line that Nadia refused to cross, regardless of the consequences for her cover or her family's financial security. Instead, she began what she later thought of as her own small resistance campaign, subtly altering translations to remove the most threatening elements, providing incorrect contact information that would prevent harassment campaigns from reaching their targets, and introducing translation errors that made Vincent's communications appear less competent and therefore less credible to their recipients. The technique required extraordinary linguistic skill and cultural knowledge to maintain plausible deniability while systematically undermining the effectiveness of Vincent's intimidation tactics. Each small act of sabotage carried the risk of discovery and potentially violent retaliation. But Nadia found that her conscience could no longer accommodate passive documentation of operations that directly threatened people she had sworn to protect. The delicate balance of her double life was maintained through a combination of careful performance and technical skill. Her State Department training providing the foundation for deception that kept her alive while gathering evidence that would eventually bring down Vincent's entire operation. Her regular communications with Detective Morgan Blake evolved into a sophisticated intelligence operation, with dead drops and coded messages that allowed her to transfer massive amounts of documentation without triggering Crawford International security protocols. The scope of evidence was staggering. Financial records proving systematic fraud, communications documenting violence against humanitarian workers, and strategic plans that revealed operations in a dozen countries where Crawford International had manipulated refugee crises for profit. But with each piece of evidence gathered, Nadia became more aware that Vincent's suspicions about her loyalties were growing, and that her time as an effective undercover asset was rapidly running out as the stakes continued to escalate beyond anything she had originally anticipated. The surveillance photograph arrived on Nadia's desk Tuesday morning, slipped between routine translation requests with the kind of casual precision that suggested her every movement was being monitored more carefully than she had realized. The image showed her mother leaving the hospital after her latest treatment, unaware that she was being followed by men whose professional demeanor couldn't quite disguise the implied threat of their presence. Vincent's message was clear without being explicit. He had identified her most vulnerable pressure point and was prepared to apply leverage with whatever force necessary to ensure her continued cooperation. The photograph was accompanied by a handwritten note in Vincent's precise script. "I trust your mother's treatment is progressing satisfactorily. Healthcare can be so complicated for families without proper insurance coverage. The polite concern masked a threat that made Nadia's blood run cold. The realization that her investigation had put her mother directly in harm's way while she had been focused on gathering evidence against Vincent's international operations. Detective Morgan Blake's emergency contact protocol activated that afternoon. The coded message system they had established indicating maximum urgency and potential compromise of Nadia's operational security. Their meeting took place in the basement parking garage of a downtown office building. Morgan's presence there suggesting that federal resources were being deployed to protect both Nadia and the evidence she had been gathering. "Crawford knows," Morgan said without preamble, her voice carrying the tension of someone who had seen undercover operations go sideways before. "Our sources indicate that his security team has been conducting background checks that go deeper than standard employment verification. And your name has appeared on watch lists that suggest he's preparing to move against potential threats to his organization." The federal investigation had reached a critical juncture where Vincent's growing paranoia was forcing timeline acceleration that would either result in successful prosecution or catastrophic exposure of their entire operation. Morgan's briefing revealed that Crawford International's operations extended far beyond what even Nadia had uncovered through her inside access, involving networks of corruption that reached into congressional offices, judicial appointments, and military contracting relationships that had been carefully cultivated over more than a decade. Vincent's humanitarian fraud was just one component of a larger criminal enterprise that had systematically exploited American foreign aid programs to generate profit while destabilizing regions that were then targeted for resource extraction and weapons sales. The scope of evidence required for successful prosecution was massive, and the window for gathering that evidence was rapidly closing as Vincent's security apparatus identified potential threats and began implementing countermeasures. "We need documentation of his direct involvement in ordering violence against aid workers," Morgan explained with the clinical precision of someone who understood exactly what kind of evidence would survive legal challenges. "Financial records prove fraud, but murder charges require proof of intent and direct communication that can't be explained away through corporate structure." The trap was set with the kind of careful planning that reflected both Nadia's desperation and Morgan's experience with high-stakes operations that balanced law enforcement objectives against human safety considerations. Vincent's growing suspicions about Nadia's loyalties would be exploited through carefully staged communications that would prompt him to reveal information that could serve as definitive legal evidence. The plan required Nadia to appear increasingly valuable to Vincent's operations while secretly recording conversations that would document his direct involvement in ordering violence against humanitarian workers, including the murder of her former State Department colleague 3 years earlier. The revelation that Vincent had been responsible for killing David Morrison, a dedicated aid worker whose death had been attributed to regional violence, transformed Nadia's investigation from professional obligation into a mission of justice for someone whose life had been destroyed by the same corruption that had ended her own diplomatic career. Vincent's office that evening felt different from her previous visits. The familiar space now charged with an underlying tension that suggested important decisions were being made behind carefully maintained facades of routine business discussions. His greeting carried a warmth that felt calculated rather than genuine, and his casual questions about her mother's health felt like probes designed to gauge her emotional state and potential vulnerabilities. The conversation began with routine discussion of upcoming foundation board meetings and resource allocation decisions, but gradually evolved into something more explicit, as Vincent tested her reactions to increasingly direct descriptions of how obstacles to business success were typically managed. When he mentioned that some humanitarian workers had proven remarkably resilient to administrative pressure and required more creative solutions, Nadia felt her recording device warm against her skin while she maintained the expression of professional interest that had become second nature during her months of deception. The confession came with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself beyond consequence. Vincent describing David Morrison's death as a regrettable but necessary business decision that had prevented exposure of operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His account was detailed enough to constitute definitive evidence of premeditated murder, including specific arrangements made with Syrian intermediaries and timeline coordination that proved direct involvement rather than simple corporate negligence. Morrison was brilliant, Vincent admitted with something approaching admiration. But he had the kind of moral absolutism that makes compromise impossible. When he started connecting our resource extraction operations to refugee displacement patterns, he became too dangerous to manage through conventional means. The recording device captured every word with digital precision, while Nadia struggled to maintain composure in the face of casual discussion of her friend's murder. The man whose death had been attributed to regional violence, but was actually ordered by someone who viewed human life as an accounting problem to be solved through efficient elimination. Vincent's security team arrived as if summoned by some invisible signal, their presence transforming what had appeared to be a routine business meeting into something far more dangerous as the scope of Vincent's paranoia became clear. Marcus Sullivan's expression carried the professional neutrality of someone who had conducted similar conversations before. His questions about Nadia's recent activities and communications patterns delivered with the kind of systematic precision that suggested comprehensive surveillance and detailed analysis of her behavioral patterns. The realization that her cover had been completely penetrated created a moment of perfect clarity. The game was over, the evidence was gathered, and survival now depended on tactics that her diplomatic training had never adequately addressed. But as Vincent's smile took on the predatory quality she had learned to recognize as his most dangerous mood, Nadia's hand moved to the emergency signal device that would bring federal backup, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her investigation ended in justice or simply added another body to Vincent Crawford's impressive list of business solutions. The emergency signal activated federal response protocols that had been carefully planned for exactly this scenario. Though the timeline was accelerating faster than anyone had anticipated as Vincent's security team moved with the efficiency of professionals who had conducted similar operations before. Nadia's hand remained steady on her purse strap, the hidden transmitter sending coded pulses that would bring Detective Morgan Blake and her federal backup team to Crawford International's headquarters within minutes. But those minutes felt like hours as Vincent's expression shifted from calculated charm to something approaching genuine anger. His discovery of her true loyalties wasn't complete. The recording device remained undetected, and her communications with federal investigators had been masked well enough to appear routine rather than systematic. But his suspicions had reached the point where decisive action was required to protect his operations from exposure. Marcus Sullivan's positioning near the office doors suggested that leaving wouldn't be a simple matter of professional courtesy, and the weapons concealed beneath his jacket were probably intended for more than corporate security purposes. Vincent's interrogation began with the kind of sophisticated psychological pressure that revealed extensive experience in extracting information from reluctant subjects. His questions designed to probe the extent of federal knowledge about Crawford International's operations, while determining how much damage Nadia's investigation might have already caused. His tone remained conversational, almost friendly, as he described the various ways that investigative journalists and whistleblowers had historically disappeared in regions where Crawford International maintained business interests, the implication being clear without requiring explicit threats that might be recorded or repeated. The interesting thing about humanitarian work, Vincent observed with casual malice, is that people disappear all the time in conflict zones, and the international community has learned to accept these losses as tragic but inevitable consequences of working in dangerous environments. The statement was delivered with the kind of professional detachment that made it clear he had ordered such disappearances before and would do so again if circumstances required. Nadia's response was calculated to buy time while demonstrating value that might keep her alive long enough for federal backup to arrive, her diplomatic training providing the foundation for negotiation tactics that balanced apparent cooperation with careful protection of sensitive information. She acknowledged her investigation while minimizing its scope, admitted to federal contact while suggesting it was routine rather than systematic, and portrayed her motivations as personal rather than professional, in ways designed to make Vincent believe that her cooperation could be purchased rather than forced. The performance required extraordinary self-control as Vincent described her mother's current location with precision that suggested real-time surveillance. his casual mention of hospital room numbers and visiting hours making clear that any resistance would result in immediate retaliation against the person she most wanted to protect. But beneath her apparent submission, Nadia was calculating distances, identifying potential weapons, and preparing for the kind of violence that her State Department training had covered in theory, but never quite prepared her to implement in practice. The revelation that Vincent's operations were already collapsing came not from federal intervention, but from international pressure that had been building beyond his awareness. Phone calls from European partners whose humanitarian organizations were facing unprecedented scrutiny from regulatory authorities who had somehow obtained detailed financial records of Crawford International's offshore operations. Nadia's intelligence gathering had been just one component of a larger investigation that included Interpol cooperation, international banking oversight, and diplomatic pressure from Gulf states whose royal families had discovered that their charitable contributions were being systematically diverted to fund weapons sales and resource extraction that violated their explicit instructions about humanitarian aid distribution. The scope of exposure was comprehensive enough to threaten not just Crawford International, but an entire network of related companies and political relationships that Vincent had spent decades building and protecting through careful management of information flow and strategic elimination of threats. Vincent's empire was dissolving in real time as frozen bank accounts, canceled contracts, and international arrest warrants transformed his carefully constructed business operations into liability rather than asset. Each phone call bringing news of another component of his network being exposed and dismantled by coordinated international law enforcement action. The Al-Noor Foundation's board meeting had been canceled and replaced with emergency sessions designed to identify how their humanitarian programs had been systematically undermined. Dr. Sarah Mansouri, leading investigations that would restore the Foundation's mission while ensuring that similar infiltration could never occur again. Nadia's former diplomatic colleagues had mobilized networks of contacts across multiple governments, their combined influence creating pressure that transcended any single jurisdiction and made Vincent's usual tactics of corruption and intimidation ineffective against the scope of opposition he was facing. The man who had built his success on information control and strategic violence found himself confronted by adversaries who possessed superior resources and international authority that his corporate structure couldn't challenge or corruption couldn't neutralize. The final confrontation was interrupted by federal agents whose arrival signaled the end of Vincent Crawford's criminal enterprise and the beginning of what would become one of the largest humanitarian fraud prosecutions in American legal history. Detective Morgan Blake's team moved with practiced efficiency, serving warrants that had been prepared months in advance while securing evidence that would support charges ranging from financial fraud to conspiracy to commit murder across multiple international jurisdictions. Vincent's arrest was conducted with the kind of professional courtesy that masked the devastating scope of his legal exposure. Charges that would result in asset forfeiture worth hundreds of millions of dollars and prison sentences that would effectively end his life as he had known it. Marcus Sullivan and the remaining security team surrendered without resistance, their pragmatic assessment of the situation leading to cooperation agreements that would provide additional evidence against Vincent's network while securing reduced sentences for their own participation in criminal activities. The epilogue unfolded over the following months as Nadia's evidence provided the foundation for prosecutions that dismantled an entire network of humanitarian fraud and restored funding to legitimate aid programs that had been systematically undermined by Vincent's operations. Her return to international consulting work was facilitated by the same diplomatic contacts who had mobilized to support the investigation. Her reputation rebuilt through recognition that her original whistleblowing had been vindicated by subsequent events that proved the scope and sophistication of the corruption she had attempted to expose. The refugee assistance organization she established with recovered Crawford International assets became a model for transparent humanitarian aid distribution. Its operations supervised by international oversight committees that included representatives from the communities being served rather than simply the governments and corporations providing funding. Mrs. Palmer's medical treatments were completed successfully, her recovery providing the personal victory that made Nadia's professional restoration meaningful rather than simply satisfying. And their relationship emerged stronger for having survived the pressures that Vincent's threats had created. In the end, The waitress who had responded in perfect Arabic to a rich man's condescension had not only exposed systematic corruption, but had helped restore hope to thousands of families whose lives had been improved by programs that would now operate with the integrity their original designers had intended. Some battles are won with words that cut deeper than swords, fought by people who understand that true power lies not in what you can destroy, but in what you choose to protect. If this story resonated with you, share where you're reading from in the comments. Stories like these need witnesses, and voices like yours give them power.